My worst game jam. It all started the day I was born. Fast forward roughly 2 decades, and I found myself saying, wow, another game jam. Or should I say, since you're currently watching a random game jam devlog, I'm going to make the bold assumption that you already know what a game jam is. I'd even wager that you've likely already heard of the Wowie jam, so as to not bore you, let's move on. This year, the theme was Failure is Progress, and boy did I fail. But since this is a making of video, it's really only fair that I show you, well, the making of. My first idea was to make a game about making a game, where failures in development add up to overall progress towards a finished playthrough. But I quickly realized that I didn't have a clear idea of how to make a story game of this type, especially not fast and efficiently, so I scrapped it for a much simpler idea. A 2D puzzle platformer. I know, how original. I've already made mini puzzle games in the past, so I was really hoping to make something outside my comfort zone during this jam. That clearly didn't happen. It had nothing to do with the fact that I was simply too lazy to make something original, but rather because I was already game dev'd out after spending the week developing my main project Senseless, which I've released some amazing devlogs for, by the way. And I just wanted to make something short and simple for the Wowie jam. All things considered, I'm quite happy with the finished product. Since the jam was only 3 days long, I needed to think of a simple mechanic so I could focus the rest of my time on levels and polish. The theme of failure being progress immediately made me think of Minecraft Death Swap. Death Swap is a game where 2 players try and kill each other with traps, the twist being, every so often the 2 players swap positions, so a perfectly timed death trap for yourself may end up being the perfect trap for your opponent. Thus, setting yourself up for failure means progress towards your eventual victory over your feeble opponent. Unfortunately, I wasn't about to make a co-op game for a 3-day jam, so instead of playing Death Swap against another player, I decided to make you play against the computer. If you think I mean an interesting game where you go toe-to-toe with an AI trying to outsmart you, well, 3-day jam, remember? Instead, the computer is just a bunch of extremely simple enemies, so here's how the game works. Every 5 seconds, the player swaps position with the nearest enemy. In each level, the player needs to destroy all the enemies and reach the exit portal, which only opens once all the enemies are dead. But since the player has no direct means of killing the enemies, they need to position themselves so the enemy dies when they swap locations. Incredibly simple. But just in case the player found the swap mechanic too confusing, I put a countdown timer at the top of the screen, a bright line between them and the nearest enemy, and a shrinking box to show when the swap's about to occur. Simple. Truth be told, all the base mechanics for this game only took about an hour. So why did this game take, well, longer than 1 hour? Art. Believe it or not, Here Nor There wasn't always the artistic masterpiece you see before you. Yes, Here Nor There is the name of the game, and yes, that's the first time I've said it, but I'm going to continue to call it my game, because randomly saying here nor there in the middle of sentences sounds rather odd, but that's neither here nor there. Anyways, like I said, the game didn't always look this stunning. Like any other game, it started out as a blocky prototype, and when the time came to add art, I quickly realized that I had no idea what to do. The style I had envisioned in my head was basically a carbon copy of my last jam game, Unsaturated. Since the games were already so similar, using the same assets would have to be some form of sin, so instead I decided to finally exit my comfort zone and try a different art style. And oh god, I should not have done that. If your eyes are already bleeding, just think of me. I had to stare at this when I drew it. After this failure of an attempt, I decided that it was time I made some progress. See what I did there? So I went on back into my comfort zone and made 16 by 16 pixel art based off the same exact tile map I had created for Unsaturated. However, even with bloom and other post-processing effects hiding the terrible art, the game still looked rather bland. So I went on colorhunt.co and copied a bunch of palettes. And since I couldn't decide which to use for the game, I just made the game decide for me by switching colors every time a level starts or the player gets teleported. Now that the game was looking halfway decent, I could focus on level design. I only made 10 levels because I quickly realized that the mechanics I chose didn't lend themselves much to puzzle variety, but rather the same type of puzzle had exponentially harder difficulties. So to keep it simple, I just made a few tutorial levels and then threw the player headfirst into the rest of the game. Aren't I so considerate? Truth be told, this game has design flaws at its core. The very nature of the involuntary swap in a puzzle setting means that instead of learning from your mistakes and coming up with an interesting solution, most of the game is spent in a dance battle against the enemies, hoping you get lucky with the timing. And that isn't very fun, or fair for the player. Unfortunately, I realized this flaw far too late in development, so instead of trying to fix it, I focused on finishing the game, so that it may be a lesson on what not to do. I suppose it will be a sweet surprise when I read the reviews, which can be found on the game's itch page, where you can also play the game. Wasn't that transition smooth? Speaking of smooth transitions, subscribe. Because I asked you to, or because you want to see more amazing games made by me. For example, my game Senseless, where you control your senses, which I've already started posting devlogs for on this channel. And yes, that's the second time I've promoted myself in one video. That's how shameless I am. And I want you to be shameless too, so why don't you avoid shame by liking this video and subscribing to see more of my videos so you can like those as well. All this begging is starting to make me feel rather ashamed of myself. So, goodbye.